Hello, AR228, and thank you for joining me. My name is Matthew Plord, and I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am bringing you this presentation from my home located on the Haldeman Tract, traditional territory of the Neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Today, I will be walking you through the true cost of Canada's largest national historic site, the development of the Trent-Severn Waterway. I'll begin by setting the scene for you all. The Trent-Severn Waterway itself bridges the divide between Trenton on Lake Ontario and Port Severn on Georgian Bay, Lake Huron, following the route of major rivers carved out of the Canadian Shield. The first area constructed was a wooden lock at Bobcaygeon in 1833. Over the course of 180 years, beginning at Lock 1 in Trenton, Ontario and Canada would undertake their longest-lasting public enterprise by constructing the complete system, passing through 36 conventional lift locks, 2 hydraulic locks, flight locks, and even a marine railway, ending at Lock 45 in Port Severn, which first opened its passage in 1920. The system as a whole spans a remarkable 386 kilometers. This waterway and its impact on Indigenous heritage is the focus of my research paper. Throughout our discussion today, we will take a look at colonial interests in the areas. We've already briefly touched on the timeline of development, but we'll explore that a little bit more in depth. We'll also explore some of the benefits that are provided to us by the Trent-Severn Waterway, and most importantly, ultimately, the focus of my research paper is exploring the detrimental impacts that the waterways had on Indigenous heritage. We'll do that by looking at past and present government policies, and I've done my best to include Indigenous perspective. I'll conclude with some suggestions for moving forward. The beginning of colonial interest in these areas began well before 1833 and the construction of that first piece of infrastructure in Bobcaygeon. When European explorers began documenting the New World, the major rivers that would later become the backbone of the Trent-Severn Waterway were also mapped. From 1603 to 1627, French missionaries like Samuel de Champlain and Etienne Brulé made note of these rivers, like the Kiondacaria, which is now known as the Severn River and serves as the westernmost outlet for the modern waterway at Port Severn on Georgian Bay. King George III himself was presented with the first known survey of the Severn River, drawn on birch bark by the wife of Lieutenant Governor John Grave Simcoe in 1796. These actions effectively paved the way for future developments centuries later. Preceding this early post-contact exploration and officially beginning with the construction of the Bobcaygeon Lock in 1833, the government and private ventures would construct the waterway. Over almost 100 years, they would complete the final segment on the Severn River and Swift Rapids in 1920, with a cost estimated to be just under $300 million when adjusted for inflation. The waterway is comprised of a total of 36 conventional locks, 2 lift locks, 2 flight locks, and a marine railway, as I stated earlier. With the scope of post-contact exploration and a rough chronology of its development now established, I can begin to discuss the benefits that the Trent-Severn Waterway provides us. From an economic perspective, these rivers of Ontario served as vital routes for the transportation of furs, timbers, and other goods that could be considered amongst the earliest colonial endeavors in the province. Without the establishment of these prosperous industries, it's undoubted that the colony wouldn't have been able to establish an effective foothold and grow into the nation-state of Canada. In contemporary times, these industries remain large economic forces. Fur, which is often assumed by most to be a bygone industry, is not. According to the Fur Institute of Canada, it still accounts for about $1 billion of Canada's annual economic activity. Lumber also remains the dominant force of Canada's economy, accounting for 12.5% of the GDP, or more than $67 billion back in 2016. While these endeavors may not be seen as, necessary or incredibly important today, especially when considering environmental impacts that they've had by connecting the frontier lands of Muskoka and Ontario's north with Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence rivers, these lakes and rivers along the modern Trent-Severn Waterway opened the vital passage for these critical goods to flow to and from Europe. The waterway now, of course, is primarily used for recreation, but it paved the way, so to speak, for Canada to develop a strong economy of its own, free from its European roots. Following the War of 1812, as America, for all intents and purposes, did succeed in capturing control of the Great Lakes, Joseph Portlock was dispatched by the colonial government to formally assess the potential to make the Severn a canal, to ensure that defense infrastructure could be placed on Georgian Bay. He describes this undertaking as not beyond the reach of science, and he describes that the Severn River offers the greatest obstacles to improvements. This effectively demonstrates that European settlers and the newly formed colonial government had active interest in canalizing Ontario's rivers to not only serve economic needs, but also to serve as a piece of critical defense infrastructure that was necessary to defend the Dominion. Today, the Trent-Severn Waterway is designated as a National Historic Site. In fact, it's Canada's largest National Historic Site. This designation was given to the Trent-Severn Waterway to salute human ingenuity, and it is heralded by Parks Canada as Canada's renowned inland passageway. Coinciding with the development of industry that we talked about previously along the Trent-Severn system, tourism was also taking root. In the 19th and 20th centuries, wealthy North Americans began building elaborate vacation destinations throughout Ontario, particularly in the Kawartha and Muskoka regions. In 2018, the federal government reported that over 500,000 visitors had traveled through the waterway to explore lumber towns, farm villages, and the spectacular pre-Cambrian landscape of the Canadian Shield. From a personal perspective, this waterway also helped inspire me to pursue my degree in archaeology, as in my childhood, I had spent my summers at the end of the system on Little Lake, which is Loch 45 in the system. I recall hearing a story from a family member about the construction of the lock system, the flooding that had resulted, and imagining to myself what treasures lay under the water. Missing from the considerations made by Europeans focused on increasing efforts of trade and security for their newly formed colonies, missing from the governments of yesterday and today, and missing from the perspective of settlers and their descendants, my childhood self included, was that of Indigenous presence and ownership of the lands and heritage that lie beneath. Out of personal interest, I attempted to create a map showing the extent of flooding around Little Lake and the Gloucester Pool following the construction of the Big Chute Marine Railway in Loch 45, the final two pieces of the Trent-Severn Waterway. In my research, I came across a tax dispute between a landowner and the municipality that showed that they were paying property tax for square footage much larger than the island itself appeared to be. It was assessed that the portion the municipality had documented as being above the waterline was much larger in the past, as flooding almost 10 feet higher had drastically reduced the amount of land available above the waterline. Through archaeology, we're able to assess the occupation of these lands along the Trent-Severn Waterway. One example of that is the Tay Point project conducted by Wilfrid-Laurier University. The study establishes empirical evidence showing that the occupation of the shorelines resulted or was from as early as 1400 current era. Indigenous knowledge of the rivers and lakes in Ontario was seen as an asset by early Europeans, and the Hatsastari site is of particular interest to researchers like Dr. Bonnie Glencross and Gary Warwick for its potential to demonstrate what the contact period looked like in this area. A Hatsastari is described by Glencross et al. In their 2017 paper as one of, quote, several large village sites believed to be sequentially occupied, end quote. It is well understood that human settlement typically occurs around water sources, and the rivers and lakes of Ontario are no exception. If the alteration of this one small segment of the Trent-Severn Waterway through the construction of the hydroelectric system at Big Chute and the lock at Port Severn could alter the water levels as dramatically as 10 feet, what effects did the construction of the rest of the system have on Indigenous culture and heritage? Parks Canada began a survey through their Underwater Archaeological Services team, in which they sought to inventory cultural heritage sites now submerged along the waterway. In 2002, UAS published a paper in Ontario Archaeology describing this survey and noted that at that time they were not actually conducting any site analyses, they were merely trying to identify site locations. The author, Stevens, did note that Parks Canada has established sites along the Trent-Severn dating from the Archaic period all the way to the Late Woodland period, and that they have uncovered diagnostic artifacts, including a polished slate point, a broadpoint ceramic rim sherds. They also unearthed a particularly important limestone turtle carving. While Parks Canada now recognizes the importance of protecting First Nations cultural heritage, it's worth noting that despite being legally obligated as part of treaty negotiations with First Nations to do so, It took until the 21st century for the federal government to consider reviewing the locations of the sites now underwater. As indigeneity in the academic community increases, there are examples like that of the chief of the Kawartha Anishinaabe First Nation in Burleigh Falls, Chris Nargang. He also happens to be an avocational archaeologist who conducted a study on White Island in Rice Lake. He confirmed that the erosion of shorelines had displaced a continuous 350-meter stretch of deposits that were related to occupation of the site. Nargang also published a paper in the same volume of Ontario Archaeology that Stevens from Park Canada did, titled The State of Archaeology and First Nations, in which he explores contemporary conflicts between federal or provincial legislation and First Nations. Through his own experiences, he casts a shadow of doubt on Parks Canada's reform towards its cultural heritage management practices. In a personal communication received by Nargang from Jim Norris, then a Parks Canada liaison, one can clearly ascertain the federal government's position. Quote, "There is no culturally inherent right to First Nations artifacts on federal lands." End quote. Parks Canada strongly asserted here, at least at the turn of the 21st century, that all submerged Indigenous heritage is the property of the federal government. Has this policy changed? Posted today on Parks Canada's webpage, under the heading of Managing Archaeology, it is stated that archaeological heritage is an essential element in the affirmation of our Canadian identity and a source of inspiration and knowledge. It is the policy of the Government of Canada to protect and manage this heritage. It's no stretch of the imagination for scholars of archaeology to immediately recognize the political implication of this statement and the form of statecraft that it embodies, leveraging archaeology to bolster the cultural identity of the nation of Canada. It's interesting then that even today, efforts to define Parks Canada's relationships with Indigenous people is sequestered to a separate section of their public access web pages under the heading Indigenous Relations, and their published mission statement, Mapping Change. Michael Nadler, current CEO of Parks Canada, has a statement sharing that, quote, "Parks Canada is honored to work with Indigenous communities from coast to coast," end quote, and that in developing, quote, "Mapping Change," end quote, they collaborated extensively with Indigenous peoples. Nadler also formally states that Parks Canada recognizes the United Nations declarations of the right of Indigenous peoples, and that reconciliation, quote, "means different things to different people." Through Mapping Change, the federal government acknowledges that atrocities were committed in the past and that today the agency of Parks Canada serves the, quote, "role of manager," end quote, for over 90% of federally owned lands. They use verbiage conducive to perceived progress, such as, quote, "tangible progress towards reconciliation" or "shared journey," end quote. While I believe no one within Parks Canada intentionally projects a colonial mindset, this could be easily perceived as persistent hollow promises lacking in ground truth. In his 2002 article, Nargang examines an interesting contrast between government legislation and settler colonial needs. While assessing sites along the Trent-Severn Waterway, Nargang states that he was told, quote, "not to touch any of the materials relating to the history of my people underwater, and that I would be charged if I did not follow the rules," end quote. The rules he's referring to are the Historic Canal Regulations, SOR 93-220. By designating the Trent-Severn Waterway a National Historic Site, this legislation stipulates that removal, alteration, or destruction of any cultural resource or object in a canal is prohibited. The point of contention for Nargang and other Indigenous archaeologists is that despite this restriction being imposed on them, there is a double standard attached to it, as they, quote, "watch shorelines in front of cottages being repeatedly torn up to install docks and to beautify the scenery," end quote. This observation then lends merit to suggest that Parks Canada's actions still speak louder than their words, and that work towards reconciliation must continue, as Indigenous peoples continue to face adversity in establishing agency over the cultural heritage that remains captive under the control of the federal government and Parks Canada. The work undertaken thus far to incorporate Indigenous perspective may remain inadequate, but it is important to note that progress towards reconciliation does continue. Parks Canada's own YouTube page demonstrates this progress. One example of a truly decentered approach, one that considers colonialism's impact on Indigenous peoples and accurately portrays the role Parks Canada aims to play in these times, is their video centered around residential schools. It highlights collaboration, and it demonstrates respect for the wishes of descendant communities. Parks Canada has used those wishes as guidance for their continued stewardship over these sites, and the position they take is clearly one full of remorse for the atrocities committed at these sites, as well as a place of honor for being asked to protect them and Indigenous stories surrounding them going forward. Despite the gaps in legislation identified in earlier critiques, these small steps, in my opinion, do demonstrate that Parks Canada, along with the federal government, truly do wish to reconcile and do the right thing. It is fair to say that the construction of the Trent-Severn Waterway was pivotal in the successful settlement of Europeans in Ontario. Like all endeavors undertaken during the colonial period, it's also to acknowledge that this settlement came at the cost of displacement for Indigenous populations living along its route. As the land was obtained through treaties that have not been fully recognized or have not fully recognized their commitments to Indigenous peoples. While it's not widely considered, this displacement and the drive to develop infrastructure also served as a tool for the erasure and destruction of Indigenous cultural heritage at the expense of economic progress. Land was taken, and important cultural sites were lost due to flooding and shoreline erosion. And this destruction continues to propagate today with vacationers seeking to develop their second homes. Legislation does exist for commercial developers, but individual landowners are not required to conduct archaeological assessments prior to construction on shorelines. It is critical then that legislation continues to be challenged, examined, and addressed with guidance from Indigenous communities whose cultural heritage remains buried under the waterline of the Trent-Severn. While it's impossible to gauge the true scope of destruction that has occurred to date, it is well within our ability to limit further destruction going forward. The archaeological record of Ontario is non-renewable, and its protection along the Trent-Severn must be made one of the central themes for the waterway's continued recognition as a National Historic Site, not only for its contributions to Canada's colonial accomplishments, but for the vast amounts of Indigenous cultural heritage remains it contains. Incorporating and acknowledging the destruction and erasure along with making a true effort to document and understand Indigenous sites along the Trent-Severn would lend well to the path of reconciliation, and it is a path that Parks Canada must continue to champion. Thank you.